Everyone, and welcome to tonight's Authors on Stage program, which New Canaan Library co-sponsors with our local independent bookstore, Elm Street Books, and we're very appreciative of their being here tonight for this program. We're very pleased to have writer Peter M. Wheelwright with us today to speak about his debut novel, As It Is on Earth, recently nominated for the prestigious Pushcart Prize and the recipient of a Penn Hemingway Honorable Mention Award for, quote, literary excellence in debut fiction, one of only two awarded this year. Set in New England during the week leading up to Columbus Day, at the end of the millennium, As It Is on Earth is narrated by Taylor Thatcher, an irreverent young university professor from a fallen family of Maine Puritans. This is the story of his complex family legacy and the shifting tides of multicultural modern-day America. Art, nature, genetics, and the tangled web of familial love combined are at the heart of this complex and beautiful meander through time and history. Peter is an architect and associate professor at Parsons, the New School for Design, a private art and design college of the New School University in New York City. His design work has been widely published in both the national and international press. The Kaleidoscope House, a modernist dollhouse designed in collaboration with artist Laurie Simmons, is in the collection of architecture and design at the Museum of Modern Art. As It Is on Earth is Peter's first novel, so please join me in welcoming Peter to New Canaan Library.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you all for coming. I think I've got to dispense with he is an architect. Somehow it undercuts my bona fides as a writer. He's a novelist. He was once an architect. So I thought what I would do in discussion with my wife today, I'm going to sort of just jump into this book and read two selections from it. And each is about 10 to 12 minutes long. And then I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the book. Susan sort of gave you the rough overview. It is a tale of New England, for sure, but I hope, I like to think that the story has more universal meaning to it. Ostensibly, it's narrated in the first person by a kind of grumpy character who feels very hung up in his sort of New England background. He feels that he's lost his sense of self, and come to think of himself really as just a kind of product of other people, other events, other places, other times, and other gods, as he says. So he's sort of struggling to find a sort of an authentic self. So the book is narrated in his voice, in the first person. The book also is structured on over 8 days, and each chapter is a day in this consecutive 8 days, heading towards Columbus Day in 1999. And 7 of those days are based on the days of Genesis, and the sort of titles of the chapters each take a piece from one of the days of Genesis. The 8th day is actually the first chapter, and it's called Chapter 0, because it's based on the idea of before days. What was there before the first day? And that's his problem. He's trying to figure out what was there before days. So I'm going to read from Before Days. And that sort of introduces some of the characters. Um, Hartford, Connecticut, 1999, beginning of the end of the beginning, the void. A few months ago, shortly before Nicole and I finally separated for good, my brother began sleeping on the fire escape. I am not yet sure how these two things are connected. One day, Nicole phones from the Chiapas highlands to say that I do not love her, and the next day, one of Ben's neighbors calls to tell me my brother is hovering 5 stories above State Street, curled up asleep on the rusty metalwork outside his kitchen window in downtown Hartford. What am I supposed to make of this? At first, I was not particularly concerned about Ben. He said that he had simply fallen asleep while observing the stars. I believed him. It would be typical. Easy to imagine how absorbed he might become in the challenge of seeing any stars at all through the radiating din of city lights. These are the kinds of problems that appeal to Ben. It's a matter of science. It's not that he's particularly concerned with discovering solutions to the problems of science. He just likes collecting natural phenomena in the way others collect stamps or rare coins. He's been inclined this way since the beginning, since before the stigmata. But there's more than an interest in stellar optics at work here. He is up to something. It seems to me he's looking at the stars in a way that I've never seen before, as if searching for something missed, making a second run through original research, testing it from a different point of view. At least, this is how it strikes me. Another thing. Last week, he fell asleep while focusing on Orion's belt. More precisely, he was trying to locate a gaseous nebula called M42, a smudgy patch of protostars emerging from the sword. That did surprise me. Xibalba, cradle of the Mayan heaven, the beginning of time. My brother and I know the stars by different names. Perhaps that's what distinguishes us most. Either way or either one, I wondered if he had really seen that cluster. Even back at the farm in Maine, where M42 drifts high in a disturbingly black winter sky, it's very difficult to see it without binoculars. Nevertheless, Ben told me he found it just before falling asleep, very low in the sky, on the horizon. He'd had to turn his eyes about 15 degrees away to catch a flickering glimpse, but he was certain of what he'd seen. This is something else new and unusual about my younger brother, his interest in seeing things without looking right at them. Perhaps that's why he has me thinking about Esther again. She has that tendency, but with a difference. She has an artificial eye that never seems to close, and her good eye wanders like a ball bearing. Mount Vernon, first days. I had just turned 3 when the proud and wounded young woman from Simmsport, Louisiana, came to live with us 27 years ago. Bingham was still dangling a scabbed umbilical cord. My father, widowed for a second time, was a country physician with a small community to watch over. Esther Flournoy Bishop was assigned to oversee Bingham and me. In this, Esther's eyes were an advantage. She told us early on that she had a glass eye, but for a long time we were never quite sure which was which. Guess, she'd say. Once when my grandparents, the Careys, Steamer and Moody, came up from Mamacoke, I had to sleep in Esther's room. I was still quite young and not happy about sharing a bed with her. The sheets had that strange, familiar smell of unsolicited intimacy, the lived-in smell of someone else's home. I was glad that she slept facing away. She was not big, but she was filled out and shaped in ways that I did not like thinking about, not on her. Fighting the edge of the bed to stay clear of her presenting bottom, I watched the moonlight on the back of her nightgown until I fell asleep. At some point during the night, she rolled over and I awoke eyeball to eyeball with that glistening marble of hers. She was sound asleep, but I was alert as an owl's prey until the sun came up. Even with that bad eye, Esther was pretty in a kind of inattentive way. Every morning, right out of bed, when most people appeared disheveled and dream-swollen, she came fresh to the downstairs kitchen. She saw little point in makeup and would cut her own hair just to avoid the fuss. Coffee grounds dark, falling straight and easy from a middle part to the shoulders, it framed her lopsided and piercing look like a finely crafted oval mirror. Tucking loose strands behind the ear that was cocked our way, she'd have one eye scanning a frying pan while freezing us at the breakfast table with the other. It was hard for me to know when to make a move. I can see everything that needs seeing, she'd warn. I learned her blind side soon enough. It was the dimple. She had only one, formed from a small chevron scar that pointed to the lost eye. It tucked deep into her cheek when she smiled. Ben and I leaned up to it like saplings to the sun. My father was slowly drawn to her as well, although I believe he was only comparing scars. The unexpected love they later shared was a desperate one. Despite her slight Bayou twang, Esther found herself right back home in Maine. The details could change with each telling, but she claimed to be the descendant of a French trapper from Casco Bay who'd been part of the Acadian diaspora during the French and Indian Wars. Dragged away from his Algonquin Passamaquoddy wife and daughters in the dead of winter, La Jeunesse Fleunoise had been placed on board a British frigate along with his two sons and some other hapless Normandy men, where they were scattered to the North American winds. Like lost milkweed seeds floating off course on their snowy tendrils, La Jeunesse and his boys landed in steamy Louisiana, germinated, and produced the first passel of Jesuit Cajuns that still crop up there today. But Esther said he was never happy away from his home up north, and he drowned one Christmas Eve at the frozen border of Maine while trying to cross the Piscataqua River. That particular detail in the story was memorable, and for years haunted me each December on the ice of Walled Inn as I tried to get into the spirit of the season. But I think Esther was just trying to make a point about the importance of family. Ours, that is. Her own family life had followed the broken trail of La Jeunesse. Lucky for us, she made it across the Piscataqua. Our farm in Maine, in Mount Vernon, Maine, wasn't a real farm. My father only called it one because we had land and were surrounded by farmers. 200 acres of thick, shaly fields, seasonal streams, and white pine forest. Our less arable property pushed apart the corners of 3 working farms, the result of Abenaki land clearing, colonial border disputes, and bad surveying. My father had figured it both ways. He preferred his land as it was now, untouched and wild, only growing things seeded by breeze and God's winged creatures. On the other hand, by association with his neighbors, he felt a farmer with all the honorable virtues that came with working the land. The fact that he was commuting every other day 23 miles overland to the hospital in Augusta was incidental. He made his living in Augusta, but the patients he cared for most were in Mount Vernon. In the spring, when the newly thawed fields were swollen and stirring, he'd call Ben and me out to the front porch and have us stand quietly with eyes closed, just to listen and smell our fine agrarian life. The distant moans of McMoody's cows wafting in on the same breeze as the musty manure from Bogdampy's chicken farm, and pierced by the intermittent clang of Renault Thibodeau stubbornly readying another piece of overworked farm equipment for the season. It was during these times that my father looked content to me, not particularly joyful, but at least peaceful. Sneaking a one-eyed peek at him, I used to hope there was still a chance that he might burst forth in new life just like his land. But as much as he loved his place on earth, he was already preparing for the life thereafter. My father's hair had turned early, long before I was able to recognize how misfortune makes its marks. Esther would usually cut it for him after tending to her own, and he would wear it with a part high up on the side of his head like I'd seen in old photographs of his father. Only the thinnest remains of black streaked through the smooth white hair when Esther ran a wet comb through it. It made him look dashing in an old-fashioned way. Tall, straight spine with wide shoulders always held back and a determined jaw like an icebreaker, my father, despite everything, cut an impressive figure right up to the end. But it was difficult to look him in the eyes. Unlike Esther, he could see just fine, never needed glasses, and prided himself on it. But I knew, like her, he had seen bad things. It was mostly out of childish fear that I avoided meeting his glance, and maybe some awe as well. They were not unkind, his eyes. I just never felt they provided much of an opening. Esther said that most men's gaze stops at the horizon, but our father could see right around the curve of the earth. That never made me feel much better. That's the end of part one. So this second bit is deeper into the story. And in this section, the narrator is with some of his newly discovered family on the summit of a small uninhabited island called Mamacoke in Connecticut's Thames River. Some of you may know Mamacoke. The Thames runs up from New London up to Norwich. And there's been a fire on the island, which has cleared away a lot of the underbrush. And he's looking for a cave that he knew as a child, where years before some Indian bones had been discovered. I walk to the far end of the ledge and begin pushing through a spread of honeysuckle, following the faint trace of broken limbs and dead leaves stained by crushed berries. "Where are you going?" Miriam asks. "I'm going to look in the cave. I haven't seen it for years." Finding the hidden cleft that cuts sharply off the summit, I drop on all fours and ease backwards down the crag into rock shelter. Less a cave than a broad overhang of up-tilt schist exposed by centuries of wind-driven rain and erosion, rock shelter burrows into the hillside like an empty eye socket in the skull of the island. The entrance is hard to find. Undercut beneath its rock floor, it's impossible to climb up to without ropes, and even swinging down to it from above usually means dropping a few feet through a thick tangle of sawbriar, poison ivy, and stinging nettles. But today's fire has cleared off much of the cover. I have no trouble working my way to the cave's dark opening. Fragments of illegible graffiti, smoked and faded, cover the overhang and outer walls like petroglyphs, mysterious markings with mysterious intentions. Pieces of glass are scattered everywhere, exploded bottles. I can tell by the dank odor of overproof alcohol and urine that I am not looking at the underage fun of a high school campout. I smell the despair. The drinking is recent. The jagged bottom of a broken bottle still holds 2 fingers of dark rum beneath a peppering of soot. At my feet, a quilted sleeping bag is matted to the stone floor. Singed polyester batting buds from the damp remains like bean sprouts. A small black book protrudes from under a corner of soaked fabric. I nudge it out from under the sleeping bag with my foot, recognizing the gold leaf lettering and the frayed leather binding. The red satin edges of the authorized King James Bible still catch the light despite the flooding waters of the Thames. "What's down there, Uncle Taylor?" Angie is calling from above. Stepping out of the cave, I see her hanging from the rock above. She is on her belly, edging down the crag, feet first. She calls again over her shoulder. "I'm coming too." "No, you stop right there, Evangeline. Don't you come down here, God damn it. You go back, now." I yell loudly, too sharply. Angie freezes on the rock face. She starts crying. We share the fear of things suspended. "Angie, sweetheart, come back up here. Evie, it's all right. Come on. Miriam is calm but forceful, on her knees above us. She gently takes hold of my sister's arm and pulls her firmly back up. She is looking down at the book in my hand. Ben and Gemma stand over her shoulder. I'm sorry. Everything's okay. Give me a minute. I wave the Bible overhead at the gathering on the rock above me. I can't get away from the conference. Even up here, someone's been sermonizing on the mount. I do not mention the alcohol or the despair. Turning back to the cave, I squat in the entrance, opening the book again to the folded bookmark jutting from the top of the Bible. It is a picture of a woman, a naked pole dancer on an escort service flyer. She separates the book of Malachi and the Gospel according to Matthew. I try to carefully separate the sodden pages of heavily marked passages, scribbled shorthand circles underlining with urgent exclamation points litter the orderly text of numbered chapters and verses. Fragile as wet tissues, the thin pages cling to one another as if in desperation, resisting my attempts to pry apart their secret. The Bible will not survive. When it dries, its 1,000 pages will harden, return to wood, forever sealing its owner's words, the words that would explain which verses might have stayed the island's fire and which had fueled it. I return the bookmark to its place. The perfectly shaped young woman looks uncannily like Miriam, but there is no tattoo. She leans backwards from the brass pole, her large airbrushed breast pointing heavenward as she high kicks apart the Old and New Testaments. From somewhere below, a droning wail rises in the air of Mamacoke. Ghostly and pained, it's hard to tell whether it belongs to man or beast, or the island itself. Everything stills. Tossing the Bible back into the cave, I climb quickly back up the ledge. Miriam is standing up, alert, her arm around Angie. Ben and Gemma are down in the ashes. Silently, as if having spotted some rare wildlife, they wave urgently for us to join them. We step quietly off the rock into the cover of the forest. Oh my God, I think that's him, Miriam whispers in my ear. She points through the trees toward a man pacing back and forth along the rocky shoreline below. He's agitated, talking angrily to the river as if scolding himself for an unrevenged humiliation. His gray hair is woven into a thick, single braid down the back of a shapeless gabardine army surplus coat. He howls again, spreading his arms to the sky. The pastor of Rock Shelter. That's the man who was with your grandmother yesterday morning in the salt marsh. I recognize the coat and the braid. It's Melvin Ockham, Ben says quietly. He looks over at me. The Bone Man. He turns back to the muffled anger of the man on the shore. No one speaks. We are an audience, ill at ease, watching a performance of private anguish through the proscenium of thinning scarlet trees on the stage of a gray river's edge. Bucka, 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 bucka. The sound of a small motor drifts in, then out again with the shifting wind. He works for the Mashantuckets, Ben continues. Odd jobs. He's not a member of the tribe, but they take care of him. He's a Mohegan. Petty said he used to be a shaman, a local minister. Everyone calls him Bones. Bucka, 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 bucka. A flat-bottomed John boat rounds the island into view. Riding the swells of the coming storm, the open boat heads toward Mamacoke. A young man at the helm leans forward, arm behind him on the motor's throttle. He steers around the submerged rocks and into a sloping granite tidal pool, then turns to raise the engine as the boat grinds noisily to a halt at the feet of the man on the shore. Words pass. The old man has quieted. He stands firm momentarily, arms folded, then lifts the hem of his heavy coat and steps carefully over the gunwale. He takes a seat in the bow, facing the younger man in the stern. It is John Josephs in the stern, facing back. His windbreaker snaps in the wind about his large frame, and both men pick up an oar, digging them into the shallows to push the boat back into deep water. They act as if this has been staged many times before. Josephs lowers the engine. The shiny ear of corn on the back of his jacket reappears as he throttles up the outboard and turns away from Mamacoke. Joseph's weight lowers the boat's stern in the water, lifting Melvin Ockham in the bow. The Mohegan sits, slump shoulder, looking back at the island. We should go home. Gemma is looking up at the sky at the coming storm. Wait, Miriam whispers, wait. The bone man has raised his hand. He sits straight up now, staring up the hill, his arm extending toward us. Joseph turns. We all step instinctively back into the concealment of the burnt forest, all except Angie. She steps forward and waves back. Thank you. So, questions?
Actually, two questions. Could you explain the shift from being an architect to a writer? And the second question is, what do you want all the readers to gain from the book? To learn, get religious? What is be entertained? What is the essence of your book?
Okay. I think I can answer that. Your first question about being an architect and writing this book, everyone asks me, as you would imagine, they say, "Oh, gee, well, you practice as an architect for 25 years. This must be a book about architecture," and it's not at all. But I think there's something that architects do that I think writers do as well, and it's about designing. I think our training, I feel this personally, that my training as an architect couldn't have positioned me better to be a writer, because designing a building is like designing a story. And I felt that very much, that the practice that I was undertaking in writing the book felt very much like what I did as an architect, sitting alone, thinking up stuff, and just sort of trying to put it all together. Even some of the metaphors or phrases we use in architecture, like how do you get in? How do you move through it? What's the structure? Those are the same kinds of questions that relate to writing a book. So it's a design problem. They're both a design problem. As for the second question, what I hope the reader gets, the other thing that Susan mentioned about my sort of snakeskin shedding career is that I've been a professor for a long time, and have written a lot of academic stuff. And at a certain point, I really came to believe that writing stuff for instruction, which is sort of what you do as a teacher, you're trying to instruct students, was a less useful way to affect the young minds in a positive way than inspiring them. So writing fiction for me is a way, it's all the stuff I teach. I mean, I don't teach religious history, but I do teach a lot of environmental philosophy, and I do teach architectural history, and I do teach critical theory and other kinds of, yabba academic stuff. So all those ideas that are in my seminars are actually in this book, but they're in a story. And the idea here is maybe they get the same stuff that my students get, but they get it in a much more kind of inspirational, provocative, head-scratching, gosh, this makes me think about, that and so on. So it's about the difference between inspiration and instruction, I guess.
Are
Um, uh,
Does
um,
it help them understand you, if it does that in fact, or to understand what it is you're
well,
trying to take away from
no, this has caused a great, you know, I'm the butt of many student jokes because it's all sort of, did you take his seminar? It's right there. You don't have to take a seminar. It's sort of like the cliff notes of my yeah, the cliff notes of my seminar.
so they know about it, obviously.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. They definitely do. They definitely do. Yeah.
So, I mean, you write beautifully. It's a wonderful story. There are a lot of autobiographical, quote unquote, very broad references for those of us who've known you for a long time. But how did you get to the sort of core theme of the book? What brought you to that, the idea that start with the book of Genesis, and then, I mean, how did you get there?
Well, that's no fair. No fair. She knows me. Um, you know, look, every writer, I don't care what they say, they write what they know, and I'm no exception. This comes out of a lot of this New England history is, you know, I'm a New England character, and a lot of the history is drawn from my own history. In fact, there's a character in the book. I actually descend from the Reverend John Wheelwright, who is the lesser well-known of the two characters that my wife's great ancestor expelled from Boston during the Antinomian crisis. You all probably know Anne Hutchinson. Well, the Reverend John Wheelwright was Anne's brother-in-law and her pastor. And he tried, they were both banished together from Boston in 1636 or 38 for going against the elders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. My ancestor went north to Maine, and Anne made the mistake of going south to first to Rhode Island and then to Pelham, New York, where she was massacred. Her family was massacred by the Indians. So, and that story is sort of thinly disguised in some of the texts in As It Is on Earth. So yeah.
That's where it's kind of.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different motives behind this book. There's a big thing about the science and religion. For you know, this book kind of pokes fun with those who are enthralled by scientific method and the idea that science is going to solve all of our problems. And it also pokes fun at the folks who feel that religion will solve our problems. So nobody gets off in this book. It's, as I say, the narrator is kind of grumpy, and he's out there after a lot of stuff. So there are different sort of strands. You know, there's a whole thing about deep time too, geological time. I talk about the book as actually having nested histories, that there's a real deep history that all of us are products of kind of four scales of history. One, the sort of biotic history that we all came up through evolution and so forth out of the Chthonian muck. And then there's a sort of a social history, which has to do with, you know, the much broader span of where our families came from, you know, what our sort of milieu is within which we find ourselves. We're born in the United States, or we're born in Europe, or I mean, that's a kind of a social history. And then there's a family history, which is really about sort of genetics and the values that come down through the family. And then there's your own identity, your own self, and your own history as you imagine it from that solitary place inside your head. And so all of these histories exist like babushka dolls. You know, you've all seen those grandmother babushka dolls. So that's a kind of a theme as well, and that's why the narrator history is really important. He's trying to go back and figure out where he kind of finds his meaning. But if you ask my wife, she'll say this is just a love. The book's just a love. It's just a love story.
Kind of a continuation for question. Had this been simmering a long time in your mind and heart? And did it, did one day you just decide, well, maybe I could write a book after all? Or did it become kind of a burning desire or compulsion to sit down and start writing? I was wondering how it,
Well,
how long it
yeah.
took when you first started feeling this thing.
In about, almost 20 years ago, I used to be the head of the School of Architecture at Parsons, and one of the sort of perks of being an academic is you get free classes at the university. And after my sort of august day as the chair of the School of Architecture, I'd slip on my dark glasses and sneak across the street and take a creative writing class at the new school. And this book actually came out of a short story I wrote about 15 years ago. And the professor, the creative writing guy, was a writer named Peter Surian. And he said to me, this is not a short story. This is a much bigger book. And he said that to me 15 years ago, and I thought, oh, gosh. So about 5 years ago, I went on sabbatical. I stepped down as the head of the school and went off for a year to write it, and that's what I did.
Yes, do you have any connection with the architecture, or you have just...
Yeah, I'm still a professor of architecture at the school. I don't practice any longer. I don't design any longer.
So what's the next one?
The next one, well, the next one has a working title, I can tell you that much. And I suppose I can tell you a little something. It's called The Doorman, only it's door-man, not one word, doorman. And it actually is a book, it's about a doorman in the city who was on Central Park West and spends more of his time looking into Central Park than back at the door of his building. And a lot of trouble takes place because of that point of view. But the Civilian Conservation Corps are involved in it. Any of you who know the dark history of the Schoharie Reservoir in upstate New York, which was the last little valley upstate that was taken over by New York City's water supply, by eminent domain, took over and filled up the town. It's now underwater, ghostly remains of the town called Gilboa. It's also where the oldest botanical plants in the world exist. So anyway, it's a lot of the same sort of strands about the natural world and the cultural world, the clash of those two. And do I have? No. Susan mentioned I just picked up this Hemingway Award, and one of the things that comes with the award is a residency fellowship at the UCross Foundation at the Hemingways, and so I'm going to be going out there and hopefully getting some traction on the book. We'll see. Yeah, sure.
You said you poked fun at both of the religious people and the scientific people.
Not the people so much, but
the
yeah.
outlooks on
Yeah.
and there's some, well, I was wondering when you got interested in that and how you would characterize this sometimes, I don't know whether the word clash is too strong a word, but the difference in outlook. I mean, there's so much, whether it's, they're two very different approaches.
Yeah. Well, there's a section in the book which, when the narrator is a little tipsy, where he goes off on a rant, basically making the point that that it's the same coin. It's just pick your side. As he says, pick your apple, Eve's or Isaac Newton's. You know, and he goes on about how it's and another character, you know, asks the question: is faith and reason a reasonable faith? You know, they're both, quote, trying to make the implausible plausible. Probably when I came into cognition, about 4 or 5. You know, I come from a high Episcopalian, very rigid religious background. You know, when I was at boarding school, it was, as few here in the audience can attest, it was church every day and twice on Sunday, literally. And I bucked mightily in my pew. So that's, I think, you know, I'm clearly working out some stuff. You like my pucka pucka pucka? It was a very small. It's just a single engine. I mean, you know, it's right. So it's more like your lawnmower, right?
On trips to Vermont, though, I think you do a very good job of actually reading it with passion that I don't know if I would have read into it, but it was good to hear you read it.
Yeah, good. Yeah. It may go on audio tape. We have the character actor Johnny Rothman, who you would all recognize if his face were up here. You probably don't know his name, but you've all seen him many, many times in many films. Is dying to do the audio tape, so I'm going to audition him, see if he does it better than I do. Great. Thank you. You're welcome.